other sins, we will definitely, I think, have that mindset of it's not a big deal. Well, in the world standards and in the human eyes, you can look at Genesis 3 and think, what's the big deal about just eating fruit off a tree? Well, we know what the big deal is. God said, don't do it. And even Eve knew that. We shall not eat of this tree. So that is what it is. Anything, however big or little we may think it is, or however big or little the world may say it is, it's a big deal when it's something that God said to do it or not. And so I think that's important to remember and realize because, hey, whether it's Satan, people around me, or whatever, if I can get it in my mind that there's nothing wrong with this, I'm okay doing it, and I can just go on doing it, whatever the sin might be, then, here I go. I'm living that life that is against God.
Even if we know we're doing wrong, you do wrong to do good. I'm not sure how good example of that, but I'm picturing someone who might be, this is not a good example, but if you had, say, like a war, and you're in battle or so, and one of your guys are dying or so,
sure.
And you're telling them, don't worry, you're going to live, you're going to be okay. You want to encourage them, but maybe you really know they're not.
Oh, yeah.
That sometimes we do bad in the sense, I guess I'm trying to compare that to a lie, in the sense that you're lying to them, fibbing to them.
Yeah.
Sometimes we think little things, we sometimes do bad to do good.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's Satan.
Yeah.
That bad part is Satan. That's what he did.
Absolutely, yes. Sometimes we call it situation ethics, it's a situation that I was in, and it seemed that was the greater good at the time. But no, I agree. We have to be careful in all moments. And I agree with that example. A friend of mine said it to me this way: is like, you have to be careful. Maybe if you're at the funeral home, it's easy to say, well, he's better off. Well, maybe not. When you examine life to scriptures, so it might be better to find a different something to say, something different to say, and guide your direction in another way rather than that. So yeah, absolutely, it's easy to do that. It's easy to come up with that. Mm-hmm. Right here. Oh, go ahead.
Biblical example of that is assuming that he actually meant what he said, but Saul where he was supposed to destroy the enemy and
sure.
the livestock. He said, we're keeping it sacrifice to God. And Samuel said, his obedience or his sacrifice better than obedience, or however it was. He said,
sure.
And basically being like, you need to obey God first.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if you think that you're doing something that's right. If God has told you to do something else, you need to do what He says. And really, the point of all that is we are not greater than God.
Sure.
If God tells us to do something, we do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I saw the second example of Saul in 1 Samuel 15 where, he spared the king, he spared the livestock, and he said, well, we're doing it to obey God. Well, whether or not he was sincere in meaning that or not, it was against God, and the kingdom was stripped from him because of that. And, it's never right to go against God. I think of it quite often with Sarah and Abraham. They were promised this male child. Think about their ages. Think how it did not happen immediately, even at the ages they were. And Sarah said, well, take my handmaid, take Hagar. So they go and they have Ishmael. And I thought about that quite often. God does not need help with His plan. He doesn't need our assistance. He doesn't need us directing His plans.
It's not stuff that we've done that's wrong, but it's like James 4:17 says to know what to do good and do it not. So maybe things that we don't need to do that we're supposed to be doing.
Yeah.
Is sin. And back to some other comments that were made that we look at earthly laws compared to what we're talking about today as levels of sin. Well, murder pays a higher penalty than stealing. So I think that may be why we see it sin is sin to God. It's not, he doesn't have, I don't think he's got levels.
Yeah, great point. James chapter 4 and verse 17 of, when you know to do good and you don't do it, then it's sin. And so sometimes there's that sin that you just like the Levite and the priest, right? In the parable of the prodigal son, they did not do what the thieves did to this man and beat him, but they were still just as guilty because they did not stop and help him when they had an opportunity to do so. So they were just as guilty. And I think Trey brought out a great point there in that, the laws of the land does see, levels of sin, and some are greater punishment than others. And I think you have complete authority for that. I do. Romans 13 and 1 Peter chapter 2, I think you have complete authority for that. And there should be. I would not want to have the same sentence for getting a speeding ticket as one who's murdered someone. So you do see that in this lifetime. But it is important that we do remember the difference that all sin, was it 1 John 3:4, I think? All sin. I'm messing. Let me make sure I read it the right way. I don't want to, if that is the correct verse. Whoever commits sin also commits lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness or transgression. I've seen the King James text, I believe. And so it is against God. Yeah, great thoughts, great comments.
Black and white, the devil's all kinds of gray.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. The word's black or white, it's this way or that way. But the devil, like going back to Eve, the devil wants to give it a little gray picture. Is it really wrong? It's always best to do what you know that is right. If there's a situation that you're in and you say, well, I don't really know, it's always best to do what you know that is right and then study on it. Study on it, And if, like Apollos in Acts 18, if you change based on the Word of God, then that's fine. But stay on the safe side. If you're in a situation where it does appear gray, although again it's all pretty clear cut there.
I think we also spend a lot of time contemplating self-righteousness, and I'm thinking about specifically the parable that Jesus told about the Pharisee who was praying in the corner and the publican who was on his knees with his eyes up. The Pharisee's words are judging. I'm better than this guy. At least I don't do what this guy does.
Sure, yeah.
Even though he's self-justified, in wrong ways, but I think that's why we like to say, well, this one's not as bad as that.
Yeah.
So we're willing to self-justify and make ourselves not seem so bad. Nobody wants to be hypocritical about I messed up. It's, well, at least I didn't do that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. The Pharisee and publican in Luke 18, when you see one, I read that. It's not funny because it's a bad attitude, but I always think it's almost like he's saying, God, you're welcome that I'm on your side. When he says, thank you that I'm not like this other person, I think you could say it as, you're welcome that I'm on your side. And so, yeah, I think we'll do that sometimes. We'll notice the people around us and think, well, hey, my sins aren't as bad as his. How did I say that? When you examine yourself, it's fine to think about other people and be influenced by them, but examine yourself based on their strengths, not their weaknesses. It's really easy to look around at one another's weaknesses and say, well, I'm a little better. But let me look at your strengths. Let me look at the areas that can make me better, And so, yeah, and you see that with Habakkuk, when God tells Habakkuk, that Babylon, the Chaldeans, they're going to come in and rain judgment on Israel. And Habakkuk's like, wait a minute, He was noticing, first of all, how sinful and wicked his own people were. Then God says, well, I'm bringing the Babylonians to you. And Habakkuk's like, wait a minute, we're bad, but we're not as bad as they are. That's what he was doing. He was saying that, are you sure? I mean, there should be another way, right? But, yeah, it's easy to do that, I do believe. Mm-hmm.
What I'm doing is not going to bother you, not going to hurt you.
Sure, yeah.
But like an alcoholic, he says, I'm drinking, but it's not going to hurt you.
Sure.
But it does in the long run, because where does he get the money to do drinking?
Sure.
He could be using it on his family, or he has a traffic accident. Our sins follow us, whether we, even though we are not hurting, we don't think we're hurting somebody else, we are in the long run.
Right. Oh, yeah. Sin always affects the people around us, and sometimes for generations to come. I agree. You know, if we go that, and I think the last verse of Romans chapter 1 covers that as well, because Paul gives those 3 times that they changed something, and God gave them up all 3 times. But that last verse, he says, not only those who practice them, but those who approve of them, and that kind of goes along with some comments that we've been making. I can't even approve of it. I can't say, well, hey, that's your life, you do what you want to do. Now, I want to be considerate and kind and loving as I'm talking to someone about the Bible. I don't want to, I want to try to help one change. I want to try to look through the Word of God and say, okay, what can we do? Like I want you to help me to change. I want you to help me to grow and develop as a Christian. So that's important as well when we're talking about this subject, is to say, what can we do to help one come out of that life? And, of course, Bible study, and certainly a way. Absolutely. Do you have anything else? I thought I saw something. Let's notice the next the second question in this discussion that we didn't really touch on last week. So this section, chapter 2, verses 1 through 13, talks about, here comes a rich man. You give him a good seat. It's nice and everything. You're kind to him, show him that favoritism. The poor man, you go stand there. We might shun the poor person. And but with that comes the question, is it wrong to be rich? Is it wrong to work, to gain wealth? Is it wrong to save for the future? Is any of that, is it wrong to do that?
In this context, the person in question is not the rich person, it's the person who's judging.
Good point. Great point. In this context, the person who is being considered is not the rich man. It is the one who is judging. It's the members who are judging the rich and the poor. There have been those who the Lord has blessed with great riches, and they've done wonderful things. We mentioned last week, I think he said his name was A.M. Burton. Is that right, Trey? Well, we discussed it afterwards. He fully funded Marshall Keeble's work, and a wealthy man in Nashville, and helped Brother Keeble to go all over the United States and even into Africa and funding his work. So, there are those who the Lord has blessed with wealth, and they've done wonderful things with it, continue to do wonderful things with it, and even sometimes, even after death, it's, they left behind work can continue to be done. So that's a great point. The rich man's not being judged here. It's the one who was judging the rich and the poor. So no, certainly not. Would it be wrong? You have a responsibility to work, take care of oneself, a family. You have that responsibility, and I fully believe Luke 6:38. I fully believe the more liberal you are with what the Lord has blessed you with, and sharing with others, whether it's to the weekly contribution or things that you do personally, whatever it might be, then I believe He'll bless you with more, and to where you can do more. I always think with the rich young ruler, I always think, if he would have done what Jesus said, sold all that he had and given to the poor, I think that the Lord probably would have blessed him with even greater riches, because he would have been found faithful, and he would have done good with it. I truly believe that could be the case there, and so I think you see that in the Bible, and certainly there's nothing wrong with storing up for the future. And in our nation, in this day and time, it's even a little different. Some other nations, there's not really a way to store up for the future. You're storing up for the future is still the tight-knit community and family living, where the younger takes care of the older, because the wealth really isn't there to store it for the future. But, in this nation especially, in this day and time, wisdom would tell you to, store up for the future. And, because you'll have those years without work, that you still have to take care of yourself and take care of your family. And so it's not sinful at all in doing that. Do you have another?
Yeah, I have another thought about wealth and rich in general, the concept of who is rich, because you're familiar with world travel and mission work, and I've gone to Jamaica, and there's extreme wealth in Jamaica, but I would say that even the wealthy in the small villages that we went to in Jamaica don't compare to the wealthy that are in America, versus those that are wealthy in, say, rural parts of Africa. And, you think in this room right here, if somebody has $1 million, we would consider that person to be wealthy, but when you stand next to somebody with $1 billion, that person's not really that wealthy.
Yeah,
And so it's all in respect of where you are versus them, you know, and again, you put people against each other when you judge someone as wealthy, because, you know, I would consider ourselves to be middle class, you know, but in some crowds it means nothing.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
In others it could mean everything.
Absolutely, yeah. When you think about different areas of the world, different time periods of the world, and what some would have and not have, and you know, yeah. And I think that point, you know, in the United States, I imagine, you know, many people would consider themselves, you know, the middle class. But when the rest of the world is looking at you, it's wealth. You know, it's wealth, and people living on dirt floors with very, very little. And yeah, it's something that. It's not wrong in the least, whatever the Lord has blessed you with. I think I made this comment last week. You can always look at someone and see someone who has a little more, and someone's always looking at you and saying, that person has a little more than I do. I do think it's how you use what the Lord has given you, whether it's in the dollar figure or the material blessings that you enjoy, you know. Do you use your vehicle for good to glorify God? Do you use your house for good to glorify God? Do you use, you know, what you have for good to glorify God? You know, there's so many things that we can use. Do you use your talents for good to glorify God? You know, and so there's so many things that we can do with that. Consider 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 10. 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 10, for the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil, for which some have strayed from the faith in their greediness and pierced themselves through with many sorrows. Now, the King James says, for the love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. And I think that perhaps has caused some confusion. New King James that I just read from says it's a root, and I think most other translations would say it's a root. So, you know, the idea has been given by some that money is, you know, the root of all sin. Well, I don't think that's the case at all, because with Adam and Eve, for example, money was not involved. Cain and Abel, money was not involved. And many sins still today, money is not involved. Selfishness is the root of all sin, because anytime I sin, I'm doing what I want greater than what God wants for me, regardless if money is involved or not. However, it is true that, you know, Paul is warning Timothy, be careful, because it has caused many to go astray. And so you do have to be careful with it and make sure you use it in the right way to glorify God. Verse 17 of the same chapter, 1 Timothy 6, command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches, but in the living God, who gives us richly all things to enjoy. Let them do good, that they be rich in good works, ready to give, willing to share. I think about the church at Philippi when you read the book of Philippians and how they were willing to share with Paul and give to Paul. Well, you can see a little bit of how they were able to share with Paul at the beginning of the church in Acts 16. Lydia, a seller of purple from Thyatira, but here she was over here in Philippi working. So she had enough wealth to travel to a different area from Asia Minor over to Macedonia. She had enough wealth to sell purple, the color royal, the color of ultra wealthy in that time. She had enough wealth to own her own house. Remember, after she and the women by the riverside were converted, she begged Paul and those who were with him, there were 4 at that time, Paul, Luke, Timothy, and Silas, to come to her house. So here was a woman who had wealth. And then the jailer converted after her. He had a job, right? I mean, because he was at work. He was a jailer. And so I think you see that in the beginning of their church, and it helps to understand that this was a congregation that had income, had the contribution to where they could then turn around and support Paul as he's moving forward. So it's a wonderful thing when you see people, individuals, congregations doing good with what the Lord has blessed them with. And I would say probably more times than none, it's being done and we don't know about it, because we don't want to just brag about it, right? You know? I remember when I first started mission work, so I made the announcement in the summer of 2010 that I was going to start mission work in 2011. And so I spent the rest of those next 6 months raising support so I could be ready to go in 2011. And almost immediately after that announcement was made, an individual at the supporting congregation, my overseeing eldership for that time, made an anonymous donation, rather large amount. That was a great kickstart to someone who's given up work to raise support. To this day, I could not tell you who the person is. I'm grateful for it. Certainly. So that's what happens quite often. Quite often, works like that are being done without people ever knowing about it. That's wonderful.
I'd like to back First Timothy 6 here. Let's back up to.
Go back to 1 Timothy 6.
Let's see, starting in. The way I like how the ESV has this split because it actually splits to verse 2. It starts the section in verse 2. And I'm going to preface this by saying that this whole thing is essentially, including the part about for the love of money, etc., that this is all kind of a free rebuttal, I guess, if you will, to a prosperity gospel. Because it starts off here, teach and urge these things. If anyone teaches us a different doctrine and does not agree with the sound words of our Lord Jesus Christ and teaching that it accords with godliness, he is puffed up with conceit and understands nothing. So they're talking about false doctrines. He has an unhealthy craving for controversy and for quarrels about words, which produce envy, dissension, slander, evil suspicions, and constant friction on people who are depraved in mind and deprived of the truth, imagining that godliness is a means of gain. Hello, Joe. Now there is great gain in godliness with contentment. For we brought nothing into the world, we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich, notice it says desire to be rich, fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires, and there's that desire, that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving and desire that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with a pack. And talking about that desire, these desires, cravings, or whatever, I think the point of all that really is that we are misplacing our object of worship.
Sure.
You know, the love of money, the desire, the craving. In other words, we're not chasing after God. We're chasing after wealth, money, possessions in this world.
Sure.
And in other words, it's not wrong to have those things. It's not, especially if we recognize who they came from.
Right.
It wasn't us, you know?
Yeah.
And really, if you put it down to it, I mean, in some ways, you could even say that the desire for wealth is in essence sort of a desire for pride in us saying, hey, I have this. I have this control over my destiny.
Sure.
And there's that parable about the man building the barn.
Yes.
You know, and I think that's kind of the point of that. It wasn't that he had much. It was the fact that he was saying, look, I'm going to build these barns and store what I've done as a memorial to myself. So.
Absolutely. Yeah, if you go back and you look at the beginning of the chapter and come forward, that prideful sense of when you chase after riches rather than the true riches, Matthew 6, you know, the eternal riches that are up in heaven that cannot be stolen or eaten by moths or rust or decay. And so when that pulls you away from God, the point's being made here, and you start serving that, serve the blessings rather than the one who gave you the blessings. And when you start being pulled away, and many throughout time, it's true in the first century and still today, they start going after those riches and the think that their security in whatever they might have and the wealth built, whatever it might be, when really there's not. It all can be lost in just a moment. And the only true security is in our eternal salvation. And but made the comment of how many have used, of course, the church or denominational Christianity to use it only as a means for riches. So some years ago, I read, I think it was a U.S. government, I don't know who put it, maybe even the FBI put this out, I can't remember, and I don't know if it's still true today or not, this has been a few years ago, but it gave like top 10 ways of people doing the United States for wealth, to become rich. And on that list was religion. That was, I think, about like maybe number 6. Again, it's been some years ago. I don't know if it's, but yeah, a lot of people have used it as a means for their comfort here on earth. And I saw a thing on the news just a few months ago where a pastor congregation got up in front of the people and blasted them for not buying him a new watch as a gift. Did you see that, Shay? Yeah. And I thought, wow, could you imagine doing that? I mean, according to this article, he was just really getting on to them because they did not give him. I'm not going to worry. Look, you don't have to worry about getting me a new watch. I mean, it's expensive. I mean, it was an expensive watch, and he just was angry at them for not buying him this watch as a gift. But so many people have done that. They've used that means and these riches to go toward. Had a great friend, elder in the church, longtime preacher. He passed last year. But I remember he would say to preachers often, preach from a passion, not for a paycheck. Now, we know when you read 1 Corinthians, there's nothing wrong with paying the preacher. I'm grateful that I'm able to do this as my full-time work. I'm thankful to God and to the church at Wood Avenue for being able to do so. And so there's nothing sinful in it, but you understand what he's saying. Don't get it confused. Don't mix it up. And too often that does happen. Sure, yeah, I think that can be, yeah, you can only fool people for so long, if you have that passion or not. And the preacher, of course, is like anyone else. It goes up and down, has his good days, but that's where congregation works together, rallies together. And just want to know, yeah.
Pastor there, he was so proud of his Corvette. And being a pastor, driving a Corvette is kind of exorbitant.
Sure.
And needless to say, he's not pastoring the church
Yeah.
very long. Now, the church has totally prospered since he's left.
Sure.
His congregation management grown.
Yeah. It's unfortunate that happens, but it does, and it's what Paul warned Timothy about in 1 Timothy chapter 6, and it's what we're discussing in James chapter 1. And you see warnings about it from beginning to end, from Genesis to Revelation. You see warnings about this. And because, it's what you have to live right. But it's also what, without the proper attitude towards it with it, you can go away from it.
Whether it is based on our knowledge of someone's wealth status or not, but just I was doing a study of 2 Peter with our ladies and talking about brotherly love and godly love and how when people come into our congregation, whether they're members or not, I feel like sometimes we can tend to meet people for the first time based on this excitement of how they could benefit us in our church rather than just out of like, we're so happy you're here. And so not necessarily based on what, in this situation, they could tell between someone's riches and them not being rich, but just you see a family with kids and I feel like you're probably more eager to go meet that family as a young family that could benefit your church and help it with growth rather than an older person. And so like I said that because it stepped on my toes because a lot of times I gauge if I see new people at our congregation, I'll be like, okay, I feel like I might have something I can connect with them because they look about my age, they have a kid about my age or whatever. But if I see an older lady or an older gentleman by himself, I'm not like, I'm sure someone else can connect with them better than I can, so I'll just move on. But I feel like we as just greedy people will use how could they benefit us, which ones would benefit us more. That's who I would tend to flock to.
Yeah, that's a great point. Whether it's it doesn't have to be riches. Favoritism can be shown in any number of ways, and so that's why we want to always be welcoming to visitors and always be welcoming to anyone that we meet and get to know one another. And quite often it's those that you don't know that well. When you finally take time to meet them, you get to know them, you find out, wow, I was robbing myself of blessings, and what a joy that is.
I was also going to say, well, the concept of the ascetic preacher is also false as well, too. In other words, basically, the preacher doesn't have to live in poverty
Thank you.
in order to be